this dough is. This is not... Let's make some sourdough bread. My kitchen is a mess because tonight is Tuesday. Every Tuesday we have our small group that we host in our house. So I've got turkey and noodle. There's a lot going on in the kitchen today. It's kind of a mess. You'll have to excuse the mess and give me a little bit. This is my go-to everyday, easy, hands-off approach recipe for and strategy for sourdough. I very rarely make round, beautifully scored loaves of sourdough just because for me and my family, they're not practical. Making them in loaf pans really helps me to be able to keep the loaf from getting stale as quickly. It makes great toast, great sandwiches. My family just eats it up. And so I make this strategy with this sourdough probably 95% of the time. The other 5%, I like to throw in a pretty loaf every now and then. So if you're looking for a guide to make beautiful sourdough loaves, this is not it. These are for practicality, for functionality, for ease, because the recipe is really easy, pretty foolproof, and you can get really great loaves almost every single time. This is also a true sourdough recipe. True sourdough means that it only has flour, water, and salt in it, and that's pretty much it. So I have my active starter here. I've already measured this out. This is 250 grams of active bubbly starter. You can see there's good bubble action in there. Still pretty thick, but also pretty fibrous. I'm going to turn on my scale. Start with 600 grams of water. I'm going to add this entire jar because like I said before, I already measured out this is going to be 250 grams of starter, so I already know that I have the right amount. You know that your starter will work and is ready to go if it floats on the top of your water. So you can see that that's floating pretty good. And actually, after I put the flour in here as well, it should be floaty enough that it'll hold up the flour on top, and you'll have this kind of 3-layer thing going where you have the water on the bottom, the starter floating in the middle, and then, and then the flour on top. So make sure I get that whole jar. So we have 600 grams of water, 250 grams of starter. Now I'm going to add 850 grams of flour. And I just use all-purpose, unbleached, organic flour. And you can see that starter is strong enough that it's keeping the flour above the surface. The flour is not sinking either. And that is what we want to look for. Too much. All right. Now we mix it up really good. If you have a dough hook, use a dough hook. I have not been blessed with a dough hook. Okay, let's be honest. I have not remembered to go online and buy myself a dough hook, so I just use a fork. A fork is fine, it'll get the job done. If you have a dough hook, use a dough hook. It'll make it easier on yourself. That this dough goes through before you add salt to it, where it's just the starter, water, and flour, is called an autolyse. And that's kind of where the dough starts to come together and form and everything. This is what your dough should look like right after you formed it. You can tell it's really sticky It's pretty rough and it's just all combined together. So I'm going to let my autolyse go for 45 minutes and then I'll come back to the dough and I'll mix in the salt with it. The autolyse process is very interesting because the dough changes so much in just a short period of time when that yeast starts really going and producing the gluten and breaking down the fibers and everything. So I'm going to set my timer for 45 minutes. I've covered it with a plate and I will come back after the timer goes off and show you guys that transformation that dough has done during the autolyse. Letting this sourdough sit and autolyse for a lot longer than just 45 minutes because I had a sleeping baby on me, but you can see this is how this dough has changed since the autolyse process. So now is the time where I add my salt. I have 15 grams of salt here with probably 5 grams of water just to kind of wet it down. It helps mix into the dough a little bit better. And I'm just gonna mix this by hand until it's totally combined. You can see how much this dough has changed from first mixing it all together. That is a good looking sourdough. This is what you want your dough to look like. I'm gonna mix all that salt in. Salt's all mixed in. So now I need to let it sit and ferment, let the dough develop. So I'm going to let it sit for 30 minutes to an hour. Stretch and fold. I'll show you what the stretch and folds are next. Sit and rest about 30 minutes to an hour. Stretch and fold again. Probably do a series of 3 stretch and folds and then it will go into the fridge for a bulk ferment.
This is the stretch and fold technique, which is a lot easier to do with 2 hands instead of 1, but I'm holding the camera with the other hand. So you can see I'm kind of turning the bowl and stretching up 1/4 from the bottom of the dough up and over the top gently. You'll want to do this for every single quarter, so you'll do it 4 times before you get to back to where you started at the beginning of the bowl. And this is the stretch and fold sequence that you'll do about every half hour to 40 minutes while the dough is developing.
It's the next morning. It's the next morning. I kept my dough in the fridge all night to do the bulk ferment. Last night I did 3 sets of stretch and folds like I showed in the previous frame. It is the next morning. And with those stretch and folds, the time got away from me, and so I kept my dough out developing on the counter for way too long. It got overdeveloped. It's sticky. It's past the point of really being able to shape well. But the awesome thing about this strategy and the recipe is that it's really forgiving. So I'm going to pull out my dough from the fridge and set it on the countertop for about an hour or so to let it come to room temperature before I work with it. You can see it's very big and it's overdeveloped. And so I'm just gonna work with what I have, and thankfully, because this recipe is so easy and forgiving, it's gonna turn out just fine. My bread will turn out just fine. I'll have a great end product regardless. So I'm actually kind of happy that the dough isn't perfect, so you guys can see that it'll still work no matter what. My dough is room temperature. It's pretty jiggly. It sat for too long last night. So you can kind of see how the dough is trying to stick to the edges. You can see the webbing. It is definitely gonna be more tricky to work with. I'm not gonna get rid of it anything, but see how it's kind of sticking. Oh, this recipe makes 2 loaves. I've got my 2 loaf pans here that I'm going to put the shaped dough into. These are metal, and I know what you're thinking. Metal and sourdough do not mix. It's a big no-no. It is a very common rule that you're not supposed to use metal with sourdough. I use these every single time. And I actually,
next morning.
It is the next morning. I actually proof my loaves in the metal pans. And so they're proofed in the pans, so you don't have to worry about transferring them to another baking dish. And they're also baked right in there. And so that's what makes this so easy, such an easy recipe, is that it doesn't take very much time at all. Bake and proof your dough in the same container. So I have my dough here. I'm going to laminate it, which is just kind of stretching it. It's not as bad as I thought it was. The dough's not as strong as I would like it to be, but it's not that bad.
My toe.
You can see it's not. Did you bump your toe?
You kiss it.
Okay, come here. Let me kiss it. Better? So you can see when I laminate it, there's a few little tears, little stretches, but it's not that bad. So I'm going to fold it up, shape it. It is pretty sticky though. And there are 100 ways to shape your dough into loaf shapes. And I just kind of roughly throw them together, if I'm being honest. Like I said earlier, this recipe is really foolproof and it's hard to get wrong. So once it looks okay, I set it to the side and move on to the next one. I always have one, even though it's the same dough, it was in the same place with the same timing, I always have one that's a little bit more sticky than the other, and this one is that one. This is not how you want your dough. You don't want it this sticky. You don't want it this difficult to work with. This dough set out for too long last night. But thankfully, even if your dough does look like this, you're gonna be all right. This is still going to yield good loaves. So I'm going to let these set for 5 minutes, uncovered, and then I'm gonna come back and do the same thing all over again. Laminated and shaped those loaves for a second time, put them into my greased with butter loaf pans. That's also probably another reason why the metal works fine, is because it has that barrier of fat between the dough and the metal. So I greased my loaf pans with butter. I put my loaves in there seam side down because, again, we're not going to proof them and then transfer them to another baking dish. We're going to bake them in the pans that we proof the sourdough in. And then I'm going to let these proof. I'm going to cover them with a plate and let them proof for not too long because the dough is already overworked and over fermented and everything. But enough to where they'll expand through the dish, and then we'll bake them. You can see how sticky this dough is. This is not a tight, smooth surface that you usually see with sourdough. They'll taste great, they just won't be very pretty. I've got my oven set to 450. I've got my loaves proofed and pretty well ready to go at this point. I'm going to put them in the oven for 20 minutes at 450, lower it down to 400, 20 minutes at 400, and then they'll be done. I ended up baking these loaves for about 5 extra minutes, just so they'd get a little bit more brown. Here's how they turn out, how they look. And this one. And if you want more of a crust on it, you can always bake it for longer, but as you can see, nice and spongy and fluffy, good crumb. And these also freeze really well. And so if I want to freeze them, I just let them cool completely. I'll bag them into 3-gallon Ziploc baggies and put them in the freezer. A lot of people slice them before they freeze them so they can take out one slice at a time. I don't do that because your loaves are just going to dry out faster. So I like to keep mine whole. I'll eat this one first because I couldn't do it. Save this one for later. But they freeze and thaw really, really easily and really well. And with having that horrible of dough to start with, that's a pretty good end product. So this recipe, again, is really easy, really foolproof, and even if you mess up the dough or your ratios are off a little bit or your timing is off a little bit, you're usually almost always going to end up with a really good end product in a sourdough sandwich loaf. Is it good?